there may yet be hope. And even for some of us, there may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults, which kind of alludes to Isaiah and the suffering servant. For the Lord will not cast off forever, which kind of alludes back to some of the other places where, how long, O Lord, will you forget about me? Or how long are you going to, Joseph in the dungeon, in there for years, after being sold into slavery. For the Lord will not cast off forever, but though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he will not afflict from his heart or grieve the children of men. Let's see. So this is referencing this verse 22 in the original Hebrew. It says the first word of verse 22 is central. It is the plural form of the Hebrew hesed, a word notoriously difficult to translate. It might be read, unbreakable devotion to the promise. Hesed best defines the basic nature of God, as that wonderful scene with Moses on Mount Sinai makes plain. But the fact that hesed is in the plural suggests that it's not some generalized, unspecified good feeling, but rather actual deeds that reveal the realities of unbreakable devotion. Verse 22 reads, the steadfast love, the hesed of the Lord never ceases, although the Hebrew text might be better read as, the steadfast deeds of the Lord, we will never be cut off. The parallel line which follows, the mercies never come to an end. The word for mercy is based on the Hebrew word for womb. When poets reached for a word to best describe the astonishing mercy of God, they fastened on a woman's womb, imagining God's love to be like that of the unique love shared by a woman for her child. Any comments or questions on this one before we move on? So I'm going to jump over to what's our gospel passage for today, which comes from Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 43, which is Jesus heals a woman and Jairus' daughter. So starting at verse 21, and when Jesus had crossed again in a boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in a crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she'd been healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing at you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they had said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to him, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where she was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. Jump here. You'd never heard that story before? Well, there are several similar stories in Mark where they take one story and embed another story in it. And he said it typically happens where you have a named man and an unnamed woman. So one of the ones they referenced was the story about Herod and his daughter dancing for him. You never find her name in the Bible. This one you have Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, and the unnamed woman. And there's quite a bit of stuff in here, so we'll start with that. But one of the first questions I have for y'all is, what were Jesus' relations with the Jewish religious authorities? How did they respond to him in most cases? Okay. So back in Mark 3, chapter 3, verse 1, another time Jesus went into a synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. So as Kurt said, there were some cases where there were definite animosity between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. In this case, we have Jairus, the Jewish leader who's the head of a synagogue, coming to Jesus to ask for healing for his daughter. Now, at the beginning of this, one of the first verses says, "When Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side." Does anyone recall what had happened in this chapter just before this? He was on the other side, and the Gentiles and the guy who had been demon possessed. So now he's come back from that to the Jewish side, and up pop these two people. Now, Jerry shows up, and seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet. So he immediately approached humbly. He wasn't arrogant about it, and implored him earnestly, and he tells him exactly what he wants. "My daughter is near death. come and put your hands on her so she can live and be well. So he's obviously, one, being bold, two, being specific, and he's got faith that Jesus can come and do that. And it says, you know, this is one of the things we should use in our prayers, is to be bold in asking. You know, if we need or know someone who needs a miracle cure, not to beat around the bush about it, but to be bold and to ask. The Lord knows what's in our head anyway, so it's kind of silly for us to be wanting that to happen, and then, you know, kind of, sort of, if it wouldn't be too much trouble, could you help out so-and-so?
Jairus, it says he was a synagogue ruler,
Mm-hmm.
not a Pharisee or a Sadducee. We don't know what he was in
Yeah.
trouble about. He's like an administrator. Okay.
Right.
You know, that scheduled the things and
Could be.
make sure it's clean.
Now, I meant to ask this question because I didn't want to assume it. Does everyone know what a synagogue was or is? So the Jews had their temple in Jerusalem where they would go for their major festivals, but typically they had a local area where they would gather and do their worship. They would have a rabbi or a visiting rabbi come in and read the Torah and make explanations to them. But like Don says, we don't know whether he was specifically priestly or one of the Pharisees, or whether he was just someone who was in charge administratively of this local area. So now, sandwiched in here, we suddenly switch, and from Jairus and what's going on with him, we have the unnamed woman who's had this discharge of blood for an extended period, 12 years. Now, it's not specified exactly why or what, but the implication would be that it's some sort of a female problem. I know my own mother had endometriosis, which caused her to have a lot of extra bleeding, a lot of cramping, a lot of pain. Something that we can treat now, but probably wasn't treatable back then. Also, she suffered much under many physicians and spent all that she had. A physician in those days typically went to the more elite and were going to cost a lot of money. So she'd probably expended a great deal of funds. But she'd heard about Jesus, and she came up to him in the crowd and thinks to herself, if I just touch his garments, I can be healed. What do you all think of that? Is that a great amount of faith?
What was the ailment of your mother's? What was it called?
Endometriosis. It's what a woman has that lines her womb every month and prepares it for pregnancy.
Yeah.
That tissue gets outside and attaches to other parts of the internal organs.
John, you might want to point out too that according to the cultural laws of the Jewish people, when a woman was in a menstrual period,
Yep.
she was basically isolated and considered unclean.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't go to the synagogue, couldn't participate in any social functions.
A perfect segue to what's next. So if you could turn to Leviticus 15, starting at verse 25. So starting in Leviticus 15 at verse 25. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge. So as Don was saying, not only is this something where it's just the known portion of the month where a woman might have this, if this woman has had this discharge, she is thoroughly considered unclean. Any bed she lies in while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period, and anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean until evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and after that she will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, she must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The priest will sacrifice one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. In this way, he will make atonement for her before the Lord of the uncleanliness of her discharge. So as Don was saying, because of this condition, she would be considered ceremonially unclean. She couldn't go to the temple. She couldn't partake in stuff. People were not going to be around her because if they touched her, they would then be unclean. And now she's gone into this crowd of people. But to approach Jesus to get healed, but she's not going to say anything. I would imagine that if she were to raise her voice, there's a possibility someone might recognize her in the crowd, or when she tries to explain what she wants to get healed from, they could take offense because of it.
So it does sound like she has to be isolated.
She would be very isolated in her community. If you think back to, remember the story about Jesus at the well with the Samaritan woman, where the woman, because of her lifestyle, she was being shunned by everyone else, and so she was having to go for water in the middle of the day, not when most of the other women would go. Okay. So going,
I'd hate to be in that position.
it would be terrible. I mean, you can understand things like, what was that Tom Hanks movie, Castaway? Something like that, where he was a sole survivor and was living on an island by himself. But I mean, if you were, he had no one around him. But here's this person who, because of her condition, is isolated from everyone around him. Kind of like even the lepers had each other.
Yeah. So the men were isolated too if they had a discharge.
If they'd had, I think if they had relations with their wife and stuff like that, there were problems there. So they had all kinds of rules and regulations.
Ooh, that sounds pretty scary.
Well,
Very cool.
now, this commentary that I was reading, I read several, and this guy's interpretation really started to bother me. And so I'm going to read some parts to it, and I want to see what you think of this.
Who is it?
I'm sorry?
Who is it?
It doesn't tell me here. I could find it again. I found it on the internet. All right. So he says, this was a bold woman who approached, albeit secretly, without a male sponsor, compared to Jairus. I mean, he was the leader and he had people accompany him, but I mean, a Jewish man would not typically talk to an unaccompanied woman or a woman other than his wife or child.
Touch.
I'm sorry?
Must last touch.
Touch, true. But in light of her condition, one of impurity, as we read from Leviticus, would cut her off from the religious community and from financial stability. She may not have had any choice but to act daringly. That part sounds reasonable and seems to fit. She suffered a lot under the care of the medical practitioners. Attention from professionals was usually reserved for elite persons. The suffering remains ambiguous, but may relate to the length of time, severity of pain, and social scorn under the care of the specialists. Now, in here, our reading says, as the woman approaches, she's not saying anything, but verse 28 says, "For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well." Now, I'm guessing that she may not have said that out loud, but we read that to know what she was thinking as to why she approached. But anyway, he goes on to say, "This unnamed woman spoke, and these words provide insight into her thinking and theological perspective. Not only touching him, but even touching his clothes may provide healing from diseases. This theological rationale was confirmed by her healing." Again, that all seems to be good. However, as it goes on, right after she does this, it says, "And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my garments?'" Now, do you think he really didn't know who touched him? I mean, in the story of the Samaritan woman, she goes, "Come and see a man who knew everything about me." Other places, he's known the thoughts of the religious leaders and the crowds and their attitudes. So, I have trouble believing that he didn't know.
Well, maybe he didn't know at the moment in his humanity. I mean, there's times in the scripture where it says Jesus was surprised.
Mm-hmm.
And if he knows everything, he should never be surprised, right?
Right.
So maybe
It's
he
possible.
probably could have known had he,
Right.
got in touch with his divine
Right.
side of it, but in his humanity, maybe at the moment he just,
Okay.
just like he would send the disciples out to do things, right?
Right.
To discover, right? And maybe he already knew, but why would he send them out? I mean,
Yeah.
we're going
Well, certainly in some cases it was for them to learn and for them to develop their skills for the future.
Well, she approached him.
I'm sorry?
She approached him.
True. And you're kind of assuming that in this case that, he's going along in a crowd and she sort of sneaks up behind him and touches his garments. So, he wouldn't necessarily see her. Now the disciples respond, sort of mocking him, saying, "And the disciples said to him, 'You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me?' And he looked around to see who had done it." Just as the woman understood the changes in her body, so Jesus recognized the change in his body. So he initially plays no active role in her healing. The drying up of her blood flow was due to the discharge of Jesus' power. Dunamis is the word that they use. But no one, including the disciples, recognized what had leaked or transpired. Now this is where I have a bit of concern. He says, not even Jesus was fully aware of what happened. He was unwilling to allow the outflow of his power to occur without acknowledgement. The stealing of a healing miracle was inappropriate. It was one thing for him to touch others, but another matter altogether for persons to touch him. And that one just rubbed me wrong in the way that they were saying it. Fear, not boldness, provoked the woman to come forward this time. Yet she presented herself to him to reveal the whole truth. She did not have to return. She could have escaped with her healing intact, but she apparently understood his intense look. Periabelto? It's a common marking term usually reserved for Jesus' glare. Now, I could kind of understand him looking questioningly. I don't know that he would turn around to glare at someone in this manner.
Well, maybe what's saying is, and I've seen this depicted in movies and whatnot,
Okay.
he looked right at the person and said, "Who touched me?"
Mm-hmm.
Too, right? That's kind of what they're saying, I guess.
Right. I mean that.
But that's just all speculation.
Correct. Correct.
So what they're doing in the movie, really, or the video presentation of this, is they're saying he knew who it was. And so
Right.
he was looking right at the person, and he was waiting. He was giving them the opportunity to confess.
Right. Right. After his initial glare at the crowd and surroundings, Jesus' reaction was rather surprising. What flowed from him, power, earlier healed her. Now what flowed from her, truth, would bring forth healing confirming words. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Now, it's kind of interesting that she suffered for 12 years. You remember how old Jairus' daughter was? 12.
And they're both daughters.
And both daughters. And here Jesus is calling this woman daughter to put her at ease. So, I don't know. In my mind, when I was reading this, I just seemed a little bit off in the sense of, yes, he probably was trying to figure out what did you do and why. But if she hadn't had the faith, I don't think there would have been a healing. I mean, certainly other people brushed up against him, and you know, it wasn't like he was a Energizer Bunny battery and people brushing up against him sucked power out of him every time he got touched. But in this case, she, in her mind, had that as faith, that being able to touch even his garments would be enough. So now after this happens, Jesus goes off to Jairus' house. He leaves the rest of the crowd behind, and he brings along only Peter, James, and John with him. And when they get there, and the crowd is doing their typical wailing and so on, and he says, she's not dead, she's just sleeping. And they think that's hilarious. So he sends them away and goes up into the room and just brings those folks and the, you know, child's mother and father with him, and speaks to her in this little girl, get up and rise, you know, or, you know, almost the same way when he goes to the tomb of Lazarus, he just says, Lazarus, come out. Now, another interesting contrast is this woman got her faith that she's going to be healed just by touching him, and Jesus has to tell Jairus, you know, don't worry, continue to have faith. Everything's going to work out. And Jesus challenged Jairus to hold on to his faith, only believe, a faith that led him to the healer in the first place. Other thing that I didn't notice until just now is when he goes in and sees this little girl, it says he took her by the hand and then speaks the words. So he is touching her at that time. Other than Lazarus, can you think of another one of miracles that Jesus performed where he didn't touch the person? I know we talk about with the guy who was mute, he touched the tongue. The guy who was deaf, he put his fingers in his ears. He made mud on the eyes of the person. I guess we don't know the paralytic in the house when they came down through the roof. It doesn't indicate there that he actually touched him.
The 10 lepers,
Yeah,
I think he was pronounced the 10.
that's true. And the other guy where he says, you know, get up, take your mat and walk.
Well, and then who is the Roman soldier that says?
Oh, the centurion whose slave was
Just say
killed.
the word. I know that you said
Yeah.
I have people that I sinned. I know you're a ruler, and
Yeah.
so all you have to do is say
Yep.
the word, and it will be done.
Yeah, the centurion, I am a man of authority. I tell this one go and he goes. I tell this one come and he comes. Just say the word. So.
Lots of instances. Like that.
Mm-hmm. The more that we think of. All right. Any other questions or comments on this particular section?
If you want to watch a good depiction, watch The Chosen. They have at this particular passage, they have a good presentation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, they go into depth about the people that are singing. They're professional lamentators, so they're hired to come and lament
Mm-hmm.
when people die.
Professional mourners.
The ruler, so he was the ruler of the synagogue.
Right.
They probably set that kind of up in advance.
Mm-hmm.
They're expecting she's going to die. That comes out, and then also one thing that really comes out is when you watch it too is they embellish, and it's probably there, but is the joy that they experience after she's raised.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody just like is so happy, and you really get that emotion that comes over that you don't get so much when you're just reading the text.
Right.
You think, hey, my daughter's been saved, right? The mother and the ruler were probably elated, and that doesn't come
True.
across.
Do they show her going out to the crowd afterwards in the scenario?
The woman that in between, you mean the woman?
No, the daughter. When you were saying that they were elated, because the last thing here is,
She got up and said, "Give him something to eat," right?
right, and then he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat.
Right.
So,
In the movie or in the series, they were upstairs,
uh-huh,
and so he sent everybody downstairs, and then after he healed her, the mother takes her away to go get something to eat,
sure.
and they stay and they just kind of rejoice, and,
Mm-hmm.
they're just giddy, they all hug each other, and
Right.
Jesus is smiling, and everybody's laughing, especially the ruler because they show you earlier about he had a special relationship with his daughter. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not in the text.
No, but you could,
There's something that went on that we can't see, and
Sure.
I think it's okay to know the difference and to think of those things. I think that's reading the text existentially.
Right.
I think that's really important. If you really want to get into the text,
yeah,
you've got to read it and read between the lines and see what's going on and kind of build those things in, because that's what makes it so enjoyable to read too.
right. Well, and when you think of the one where is it, what parent, if the son asks for a fish, is going to give him a stone, or asks for an egg, is going to give him a snake? Is the feelings that you have as a parent, or the things that your parents have done for you, that you can read those things in and relate
Exactly.
to.
How would you feel if your daughter died
Right.
and you begged Christ that Jesus come, and he did, and
Right.
healed and raised her from the dead?
Mm-hmm.
How would you feel? And that's
Mhm.
the kind of things you need to reflect on.
Right.
And there you can kind of get an idea of the emotions that the people at the time had.
Right.
That's what really brings the text to life.
And in some sense, you kind of wonder, what or how did Jairus react in the future? We know that, you got Nicodemus, he came in secret, but at least he was not unfriendly. Joseph of Arimathea gives him the tomb. You have Jairus here. How did these people react in the future after this stuff happens?
The chosen, you know, they kind of fill in
Okay.
some of those blanks,
All right.
I haven't watched the fourth season came out, but I haven't watched it. I watched the first three. It's really,
Mm-hmm.
haven't seen The Chosen. And you like to watch videos, you know. It's a series, they're short, you know, an hour long.
Yeah. So it's almost like a fictional documentary?
Yeah, it's what they call historical fiction.
Yeah.
It's a genre of writing that I always like it because it just kind of fills in the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you ever read and then wonder. And that's really the way to read scripture, is read it historically,
Right.
rather than reading it and say, what does it mean to me?
Yeah.
What does it mean to present age? You should really go to historical meaning first.
Mm-hmm. So our epistle reading comes from 2 Corinthians in chapter 8 with several verses in that chapter. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of the God to us. Accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, that he should complete among you that act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. For you know the grace of God, Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you should be burdened, but as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. As it is written, whoever gathered much has nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. So as I was looking into this, there were references that in parts of Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 2 Corinthians, they are talking about some natural disaster of type happening in Jerusalem. They're speculating that there was a famine coupled with the persecution of the Christians. And so they were essentially taking up a collection to help out those Christians in Jerusalem. When Paul says he's writing to the churches of Macedonia, it said those churches included the ones in Philippi, Thessalonica, and I believe it was Baber. And that the implication is that the Corinthians had made a pledge or a promise in the past that they would provide stuff or provide funds, and now it's time for them to pony up, but don't know whether they were hesitant. So several of these commentaries talk about these verses as joyful Christian living and giving. But Paul goes out and he doesn't directly hound them as much as he talks about the Macedonian churches who were relatively poor, but they gave in abundance. Similar to the widow's mite, you know, people were coming up to the temple and they're tossing in their sacks of gold and silver, and she comes up and she puts in her 2 copper coins, and the disciples ask about that, and you know, these people gave out of their abundance, but she committed everything that she had. And at first, I was trying to figure out, you know, there's usually some sort of theme that goes through all the readings. And today we sort of had some that were, you know, the Mark story, that one's pretty good. You can, you know, see a couple examples of different faith. The reading from Lamentations, it's, you know, a demonstration that even though I'm under suffering and troubles and everything looks dark, I will still have faith that you will come again and return to me. And now we have the Corinthians where, you know, your faith should lead you to give to your church. Pastor, do you want to add any other comments?
I can't add anything because I haven't been listening a bit to other stuff.
Okay. I'll take that as a positive.
Yes, you're very trustworthy.
Okay. Maybe.
How about you restate that last thing you said? Not only giving to your church,
Wait.
but giving to those in need.
Giving to those in need. That's true.
That would be
That's definitely true.
a better way of saying it. So the need is presented.
I don't know, did you happen to hear when we were discussing the question about the woman getting healed and question of whether Jesus really knew what or who had touched him and whether he was upset at her for touching him?
I would not think it would be upset.
Yeah. So it seemed to be, you know, she in her mind had said, I don't even have to touch him. If I just touch his garments, I'll be healed. She'll have this faith. And we said that there are other places where, you know, your faith has made you well and things along those lines. And that I'm assuming in a crowd he was being jostled and it wasn't like every person he touched, power went out from him.
Right.
That this was a request for healing, even though it was a silent one. And that was the flow, and, you know.
Did you read in the commentary somewhere where it said he was angry?
It said this commentary was talking about that he was angry and glared at her, and it was, you know, how dare you touch me without permission type of deal. And it's like, I just couldn't see that.
Why would he immediately thereafter commend her for faith for touching him?
Right, yeah. They don't hang together, you know, and their thing is, well, she told the truth, and therefore the truth justified the flow of power, and it's like, that's really pushing it.
Yeah, that doesn't seem, could be anything.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm wide open to being wrong, but that doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
Because does the text say that she repented?
Right, doesn't indicate that at all.
So, and it's kind of like when Jesus says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. Man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man.
Right.
He's highlighting the whole idea of love for neighbor.
Right.
Okay, and so was she doing what was appropriate within the standards of that time? No, she shouldn't be around any people.
Yeah.
Right, because she has a flow of
Yeah,
life.
no, we were reading the thing from Leviticus that talked about it and discussing how that would have isolated her from going to any religious services. You know, people wouldn't want to be around her. They wouldn't want to touch anything she touched. You know, she was more isolated than other folks. You know, kind of scorned like the Samaritan woman at the well.
So this is again showing if any of us were in those days and a person who was unclean touched us, we would become unclean.
Clean.
Okay. What Jesus is demonstrating is when things happen, he flips the script.
Sure.
He brings life to death and he makes clean that which is unclean.
Right.
Hang on one second.
Okay.
Hello? Yeah.
Okay, well, we're almost at 10. I'll close this in prayer. Any special requests today?
You just go at your time. We're going to cover
Okay.
come back. Have no anxiety. Don't do anything else.
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the good discussion that we had today. Thank you for opening our hearts and our minds, helping us understand your word. having others give us examples of how we can better understand the things that you have put into your word. In your Son's name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. You're most welcome. You're welcome. Rogue balloons. I thought they were, throwing a birthday party for pastor or something.
Nope, just the VBS, although black would be the right color. Black would be great.
Oh my.
Oh, you gotta be as old as I am. Or even worse, you could be as old as John.
True. But I'm not as old as Kurt or Glenn.
How many did you make out there?
Plenty. There's almost 2 full trays of wine.
Oh, okay.
We've been using the leftover for
We're
their.
not using the